Tournaments are such great experiences for me, especially playing in front of the best crowd ever. And
The Miami Open is here, and Eala is seeded into the main draw for the very first time, a completely different reality from the wildcard run that shocked the world last year. She's number 28 in the world now. The WTA Tour has a generational phenomenon on its hands, and yet the way it handled her at the Australian Open told a very different story.
20-year-old Filipino tennis star Alex Eala has sent Melbourne Park crowds into an absolute frenzy.
It's hard to imagine that now because we're so far removed from it that it's almost hard to say I want to be number one. Little did I know that I would,
January 19th, 2026, Melbourne Park. Over 400,000 Australians carry Filipino heritage. Hundreds of Filipino fans had purchased tickets, traveled across the country, and lined up for hours, all to watch Eala's Grand Slam debut. The tournament officials put her on court 6, the smallest court on the property, under 1,500 seats. Fans who had come from 12 hours away were physically locked out without ever seeing the court. Filipino fans erupted, and they had every right to. Navratilova called it a mistake on air. Lindsay Davenport said she should have been on a show court, and Tennis Australia defended the call without blinking. So was this incompetence, or was it done on purpose? Subscribe before you keep watching, because this one genuinely deserves your attention.
of course, the atmosphere in each tournament has been amazing, and it's been a different start this year than any other year I've ever had. So
The answer to that question isn't as clean as the officials want you to believe. Within 6 weeks of Melbourne, every tournament that followed did something the Australian Open had chosen not to do. They gave Eala the stage her fan base had already earned. Dubai put her on center court. Thousands of Filipino fans filled stadiums at every session she played. Indian Wells went further, publicly acknowledging what they called the Eala effect, and ensuring her opening match on court 3 remained accessible to ground pass holders. Even after the tournament made both main stadiums ticketed events for the very first time in its entire history. BNP Paribas Open executive Philippe Dor told the media directly, "We love every minute of it. We benefit from it. We promote it." That is how a tournament responds when it actually takes the evidence in front of it seriously. Here is what the scheduling committee had access to before they finalized the order of play that morning. Eala's pre-tournament press conference, posted on the Australian Open's own official YouTube channel, had already accumulated 196,000 views before the main draw even began. Carlos Alcaraz, a 4-time Grand Slam champion and arguably the most commercially marketable male player on the planet right now, recorded roughly 30,000 views for his equivalent session. World number 1. Aryna Sabalenka, a 2-time Melbourne champion with a massive European following, pulled 9,000. Those numbers were not hidden inside a private analytics dashboard. They were sitting publicly on YouTube for any scheduling coordinator with 30 seconds and a browser to find. There was no version of this situation where the information was unavailable. Beyond the digital metrics, the demographic reality of Melbourne itself carried its own undeniable weight. Over 400,000 residents of the greater Australian population carry Filipino heritage. This is not obscure trivia pulled from an obscure source. It is census data, the kind of contextual information that experienced tournament operations teams at major sporting events factor into planning as a matter of routine.
A massive spot to be in for such a young talent, to have a sold-out crowd completely behind.
to do well on the WTA Tour, I'm super proud of what I was able to accomplish.
The Australian Open has always positioned itself as a multicultural celebration, marketing its diverse attendance base as one of the defining characteristics of the event. Knowing the viewership gap between Eala and every other player, while simultaneously knowing the size of the local Filipino community and still placing her match on a court with a capacity of fewer than 1,500 people, that combination of decisions is what Tennis Australia has never managed to coherently explain. Their official response, delivered by spokesperson Prue Ryan after the chaos had already unfolded, read as follows. After weighing all factors, including the significant popularity of a Range of players, Court 6 was the best option in terms of capacity and accessibility. Take that statement apart carefully. They confirmed her popularity was a factor that was weighed. They did not deny that the evidence existed. They acknowledged it was considered, and then concluded that a venue holding under 1,500 people on the single highest attended day in Melbourne Park's recorded history at 101,696 spectators was the correct placement for the most in-demand player at the tournament. The statement does not resolve the contradiction sitting at the center of this controversy. It makes the contradiction more visible. Journalist Jose Morgado, one of the most widely respected voices in professional tennis coverage, responded immediately and without softening his language. Putting Eala on Court 6 is just dumb, he wrote publicly. Ben Rothenberg, a veteran tennis reporter who has covered Grand Slams at the highest level for well over a decade, flagged the problem before a single ball had been struck. This unwise court placement was one of my first reactions when looking at today's order of play, he said. These are not casual observers firing off emotional reactions. These are credentialed professionals who understand the internal mechanics of Grand Slam scheduling, and both arrived at the same conclusion independently before the match even started. That level of pre-match consensus among experienced journalists is not something that happens when a decision is defensible. The physical consequences on the day were severe and completely avoidable. Supporters who had traveled from interstate, some documented as having made 12-hour journeys from Sydney specifically to watch this match, arrived at Melbourne Park, found their way to Court 6, and were turned away at the entrance because the court had already reached its limit. Not turned away from a specific seat. Turned away from entering the court at all. Fans crowded around. Outdoor screens positioned across the grounds. Others pressed into walkways, straining for any kind of sightline. Inside the court itself, every seat was occupied. The baseline ledge was full. The courtside bar area had no open space remaining, and security was managing entry at the gate throughout the match.
Eala, the phenomenon. We didn't know, largely, the tennis community a year ago before her run in Miami, and now it's must-see TV and drawing maybe the biggest crowds anyone outside of Alcaraz Center and the like.
She represents the Philippines, which is a country with more than 100 million people, but doesn't have a lot of history in tennis, and she's really leaned into it.
The atmosphere generated by fewer than 1,500 people in that space was described by multiple journalists as unlike anything they had witnessed at an outer court at a Grand Slam in recent memory, which only underscores how much more significant the moment could have been on a properly sized stage. Alicia Parks, the American player competing on the other side of the net, described the experience with notable honesty afterward. "It was very difficult," she said. "I was expecting it, but I wasn't. She definitely has a good crowd. I just kept telling myself to stay in the zone. I was just so focused on the crowd in the first set, which is why it went the way it did." Parks lost the opening set 6-0 in 34 minutes. She was visibly emotional courtside after it ended. She recovered her composure to win the match 0-6, 6-3, 6-2, but her own words confirmed the environment was genuinely affecting her ability to perform. An opponent being rattled by crowd intensity on an outer court at a Grand Slam is not something that happens routinely. It speaks directly to how extraordinary the concentration of support for Eala had become inside that confined space, and how thoroughly unprepared the venue was for the level of energy it had effectively bottled up by the scheduling choice made that morning.
I'm really happy to advance to the next round. Obviously, it's not in the way I wanted it to end. This was definitely one of the bigger Filipino turnouts. Also, New York was huge.
Martina Navratilova addressed the situation on live television during Tennis Channel coverage and did not soften her language. The organizers need to keep more in mind where the players are from and what the actual fan base is here, she said during the broadcast. There's a massive Filipino audience in Melbourne, in Australia, so keep that in mind next time you make the schedule. Lindsay Davenport, sitting alongside her, was equally direct. She probably needed to be on a bigger show court. She's probably the most famous female from the Philippines, certainly one of the most famous people to come through their sporting world, and there were so many fans just waiting to get in there. Two decorated former champions, both working as official Tennis Channel commentators at the event, publicly contradict the tournament's own justification within hours of the final ball being struck. That is not a minor footnote. That is the tennis establishment's own inner circle telling the Australian Open it got this wrong. The defense that Tennis Australia and its supporters would reach for is a familiar one. Rankings drive scheduling. Eala was ranked 49th at the time. First-round matches for players outside the seeded positions go to outer courts. The system is objective and applied consistently across all players. That argument would carry considerably more weight if the contradicting evidence did not exist publicly in such volume. Jessica Pegula, who won the Dubai Championship just weeks later and is consistently ranked inside the world's top 5, addressed it directly in her post-tournament press conference. "I think we saw that in Australia. When it was kind of overcrowded, they put her in too small a court," Pegula said. She did not frame this as a ranking-based system functioning correctly. She framed it as a misjudgment, and she said it as a peer of the sport, someone who competes at the same events and watches how these decisions play out from the inside. The ranking defense also collides with a broader reality that the rest of the tour has already begun to accept. Indian Wells featured Eala in its official social media campaign, alongside 7 top 10 players before she had even cracked the top 30. The tournament's Day in the Life video featuring her became the most watched YouTube content the BNP Paribas Open produced during the entire 2026 event, and it was not a close result.
I would have been able to play a big player like Madison or like Ostapenko, but I couldn't because I lost the round before.
Star Alex Eala takes center stage at the BNP Paribas Tennis Paradise in Indian Wells.
At her practice sessions in the California desert, the crowds she drew were reported as comparable to those gathered for Carlos Alcaraz, Jannik Sinner, and Venus Williams. Novak Djokovic, when asked about the congestion and scheduling challenges her popularity creates for tournament organizers, called it a good problem to have.
Having too much crowd on this or any other tennis tournament is a very good problem to have.
Andy Roddick said, "This is the type of story you cheer for because it's great for tennis." These are not fringe voices advocating for special treatment. These are the sport's most recognizable figures acknowledging that cultural reach and commercial pull are legitimate measurements of value, separate from, but just as real as, a ranking number. The WTA itself eventually moved in the same direction. In November 2025, the organization announced the creation of the Philippine Women's Open, a 125-level event held in January 2026, marking the Philippines' first ever WTA tournament. Tickets for the final sold out before Eala had even confirmed her participation. That decision did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from an organization recognizing that a market existed, that a fan base had demonstrated its willingness to show up in extraordinary numbers, and that the sport had a financial and cultural obligation to meet that demand. The WTA saw the same data Tennis Australia had access to in January and drew a fundamentally different conclusion about what it meant. What makes the Court 6 decision particularly difficult to excuse, regardless of which interpretation you place on it, is the complete predictability of the outcome. Nobody who looked at the pre-tournament numbers, the Melbourne demographics, and Eala's documented crowd history needed any special insight to know that an outer court with 1,500 seats was going to be overwhelmed. Her Miami Open run the previous year had already demonstrated the scale of support she carried. Her US Open match at Grandstand had already shown what happened when Filipino fans concentrated in one location. The pattern was established, documented, and publicly available before a single scheduling decision was made for the 2026 Australian Open. Hundreds of Filipino fans being turned away at the gate was not an unforeseen consequence. It was the mathematically predictable result of assigning the wrong venue to the wrong match. Eala herself, speaking to Andy Roddick on the Served podcast after the tournament concluded, described the experience as leaving her genuinely lost for words. She was measured and gracious throughout the conversation, as she has been at every stage of her rise. That's one of the things that makes a loss like today a little bit harder, knowing a lot of people were rooting for me, she said. She directed no accusation at anyone. She processed it publicly with the composure that has defined her entire breakout season. But the fans who made 12-hour journeys from Sydney, the ones who stopped at the gate before the first game, the ones watching on outdoor screens while the noise leaked out from inside, they had no obligation to be as composed about it. Their frustration was the natural result of a preventable situation that the available evidence should have prevented. Heading into the Miami Open today, Eala sits at world number 28, seeded into the main draw for the first time at the very tournament where her story first announced itself to the world. She has nearly 1 million Instagram followers, more than double the count of players ranked significantly above her. The commercial and cultural case for treating her differently from a standard number 49 seed was visible in January. The tennis world spent the months after Melbourne belatedly learning what should have been obvious before Court 6 ever reached capacity. The scheduling committee had the demographic data. They had the viewership numbers. They had documented crowd history from Miami and New York. They made the call anyway, and Filipino fans erupted because what followed was as foreseeable as the critics said it was before the match began. Whether that decision was the product of a system too rigid to account for cultural relevance, a genuine failure to connect the available dots, or something deliberately done on purpose, only the people inside that scheduling room can answer with certainty. But the distance between what was knowable before the draw and what was ultimately decided is too significant to keep filing under honest mistake without asking harder questions about who made that call and what factors were actually driving it. If this video gave you a perspective worth sitting with, subscribe right now. This channel covers the tennis conversations that get glossed over everywhere else. Drop your take in the comments. Was Melbourne a scheduling blunder or a calculated decision? The comment section is open.